in their life had a consequence. At the end of life, when it was time to make the journey of reincarnation, all the bad things a person did would weigh their soul down, and they would be dragged down the ladder of the caste system, forced to live a harder life the next time around. If you were really bad, you were reborn as an animal, or worst of all, to be born as a Dalit. People so low on the ladder, they didn't even belong to a caste. But if the person was good throughout their life, then they might have a chance for something better in the life after that. The Path to Enlightenment. In the year 563 BC, a man brought a new perspective to things in India. And his ideas helped many people who were suffering under the caste system. This man was called Siddhartha Gautama, but in time, he came to be known as Buddha. The young Siddhartha was the main heir to a small kingdom. His father loved him greatly and did not want him to know suffering. The young prince was isolated in a wonderful palace, surrounded by various pleasures, servants, and delightful music. In this way, his father tried to hide aging, sickness, and death from him. But Siddhartha suspected that there was more to life than his luxurious prison, and since he was a restless young man, he began to leave the palace to see his subjects. The first time that he went forth, he saw an old, stooped man. Another time, he saw a sick man, and on another occasion, he saw a dead man. Siddhartha was dismayed. He didn't know about the suffering people had to endure in the real world. He decided not to return to his life of fantasy. Instead, he abandoned all his wealth to meditate on the suffering of people in the world. Siddhartha went deep into the woods and lived without a home. He shaved his head and wore nothing but rags. Siddhartha practiced something called meditation. Using the power of his mind, he slowed down his breathing, only ate a tiny bit of food, and could remain virtually motionless for hours or even days. He meditated to learn the mysteries of the universe. He spent years meditating, eventually learning to meditate more deeply than any other man. One day, something happened. It was like a great light turned on in his soul. Siddhartha left to tell his people of his great discovery. From that day on, he was known as Buddha, which means the Enlightened One. All suffering is born from the desire to acquire something. If we manage to stop desiring, we will also stop suffering. Buddha taught that by controlling one's desires, a person could become their own master. So that when one dies, one will no longer need to be reborn as something else, and one's soul will reach nirvana, where suffering and ailments do not exist. This means a person's soul could remain in a state of peace forever. Ashoka and the spread of Buddhism. In the 5th century BC, India fell to the hands of foreign invaders. First, it was the Persians under the command of Cyrus I. And 200 years later, in the year 327 BC, the Greeks under Alexander the Great set out to conquer them. Chandragupta was the first Indian king to take back all the occupied territories and to make most of what we know as modern-day India one great empire. But it was his grandson, Ashoka, who would be even more important in bringing a new life to his country. But the story of this new life starts with the story of death. In roughly the 9th year of his reign, his army conquered the kingdom of Kalinga. It was a brutal and bloody war, and many people on both sides died. Ashoka realized how terrible this violence had been. He converted to Buddhism, and instead of continuing to shed blood, he dedicated his reign to spreading peace and tolerance throughout the region. Many works were carried out to improve the conditions of his people. From shady places to rest and wells of water to refresh oneself on hot days, to hospitals where the qualities of plants to cure diseases were studied. Ashoka spent much of his wealth replacing broken and burnt structures with temples to teach the lessons of Buddha and making his kingdom into a peaceful place. Because of this, Ashoka became one of the most famous kings of ancient India and is remembered with great respect today. The legacy of Islam. Roughly 400 years after the magnificent period of Ashoka's reign, India stopped being a single empire and became fragmented into many independent kingdoms. Each of these small kingdoms was ruled by a Maharaja, which means great or high king. As early as the 7th century, Muslims arrived in India and began to spread the religion of Islam. Much later, in the 13th century, Turkic and then Mongol warriors came from the steppes of Asia and took control of the whole country.
Wow! So everybody wanted to control India?
That's true, Pipo. But because of the influences of all these different peoples, Indian culture was enriched with thousands of nuances, stories, and traditions, becoming one of the richest cultures in the world. One of the most famous symbols of Indian culture is the Taj Mahal, which may seem like a palace, but in reality, it is a tomb. Possibly the most famous tomb in the world. The story goes that in the 15th century, there lived in the city of Agra a Muslim emperor of Turkic-Mongol origin named Shah Jahan. He had many wives, but his favorite of all was Mumtaz Mahal. He loved her with all his heart. When she died in 1631, the emperor was heartbroken and dedicated much of his life to building an incredibly beautiful mausoleum for her. To this day, the Taj Mahal stands as one of the most beautiful buildings ever built, a magnificent symbol of love. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass and find out about other influential women throughout history. Many women in ancient Egypt were very influential, and some of them even became pharaohs. In the mid-15th century BC, Hatshepsut was a pharaoh who ruled Egypt longer than any other woman, for over 20 years. 100 years later, in 1370 BC, another woman would hold power in Egypt. Her name was Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one has arrived. Her famed beauty has been immortalized in hundreds of paintings and sculptures of the age. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who prohibited the worshipping of all gods except one, the sun god Aten. Akhenaten and Nefertiti together built a new city from which they governed as equals, something which had never been done before or since in ancient Egypt. Some scholars also think that Nefertiti ruled as pharaoh after the death of Akhenaten under a different name. And let's not forget the legendary pharaoh Cleopatra, who in the 1st century BC held the most powerful men of that time in the palm of her hand. First, she conquered the heart of Julius Caesar, thus guaranteeing herself the protection of Rome. But when Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra formed an alliance and fell in love with a Roman general named Mark Antony. Together, they formed an alliance between Egypt and Rome, but lost control of Rome to Caesar's heir Octavian at the Battle of Actium. It ended tragically, but the tale of Antony and Cleopatra is still remembered as one of the greatest love stories of all time. Part 1. In another episode of The Time Compass, we learned that all roads lead to Rome. Well, there was another important city which a lot of those roads passed through to get to Rome: Constantinople.
But what made this city so special?
Well, I'll tell you, Pipo. You see, the world had changed a lot by the 4th century AD. It was not enough to conquer, plunder, and dominate territories to maintain power and wealth. Now there was another way to create riches: by trading goods with the Far East. People on one side of the world were willing to pay lots of money for the things being produced on the other side. The people of Constantinople acted as go-betweens, trading goods and money back and forth. They worked hard trading, and they themselves became prosperous. Distances from one side of the world to the other were immense, and traveling at that time was very dangerous. There weren't a lot of trade routes between East and West. This meant that all the trade routes passed through Constantinople. And so, this one city became a giant funnel where all the goods from the East were gathered to be distributed to the West. So much money was passing through Constantinople that it formed a new base of power for the Roman Empire. Not power from armies, but the power of money. Constantinople, the new Rome. The magnificent city of Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Because it was located right between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, Constantinople became a natural gateway, linking the West with the East.
But who was living in Constantinople? How did the powerful Byzantine Empire begin? Find out on today's episode of Truth or History.
Well, to begin, we need to go back to ancient Rome. In the year 306, a man named Constantine became emperor of the legendary Roman Empire. Constantine lived through some complicated and turbulent times. On the one hand, Germanic peoples were conquering everything in their paths and heading straight towards Rome. On the other hand, there were a growing number of Roman citizens who were converting to Christianity. These Christians wanted relief from repression and violence. Constantine decided the best thing to do was to move the capital of the empire to a safer place. So he founded the New Rome. Although after his death, the city became known as Constantinople in his honor.
I get it! Constantinople!
Yes, Pipo.
I'm a genius!
Constantine did something else pretty important. He was the first Roman emperor to adopt the Christian religion. This meant that a great many Romans were able to freely practice Christianity without fearing persecution or imprisonment. But, of course, the proud Romans who were still living in Rome were, well, let's say, not very happy with all these decisions. I don't agree with all the things Constantine has done. First, how can you have a Roman Empire that isn't ruled from Rome? Secondly, what happens to us, still in Rome? Faced with so much discontent, in the year 395, a successor to Constantine, the Emperor Theodosius, split the empire in two upon his death. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule both the eastern part, with its capital in Constantinople, and the western part, with its capital in ancient Rome. His two sons were the heirs to these two parts.
But the days of the Western Roman Empire were numbered, and nothing could stop its inevitable end.
In the year 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic general. Piece by piece, the Roman Empire, which had lasted for so many centuries, began to fall away. The Great Byzantine Empire. But the Roman Empire wasn't completely destroyed. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, continued to flourish. Eventually, it transformed into what we call the Byzantine Empire, and it lasted over 1,000 years. In the year 527 AD, the empire had its first great emperor, Justinian the Great. Justinian did a lot of work, and his reign lasted 38 years. That's a long time. Justinian used the vast amounts of money that were coming in and ordered the building of a great many works. First, he built the most important war fleet throughout the Mediterranean, and with it, he protected trade ships from pirates. He also conquered great swaths of territory, including Italy and parts of Spain, Africa, and Egypt. It was such an extensive territory, with such diverse cultures and religions, that it was difficult to keep everything unified. Justinian decided to unite the empire with religion. And so he told all the inhabitants of his empire to adopt Christianity as the only religion. Christianity was spread far and wide throughout the empire. He also ordered the building of a great many churches. Nobody could have had any doubts about where to go in order to pray. Two churches. Emperor Justinian wanted the best church to be in Constantinople. He decided to build a masterpiece, the Hagia Sophia, a building that was a miracle of architecture. Its cupola measures roughly 31 meters in diameter and 55 meters high. And the way that the cupola is supported makes it seem as if it is floating in air. The church was a symbol of the unity and strength of the empire under Christianity. But outside Justinian's empire, back in Rome, there lived the head of the Christian church, called the Pope. And he had authority over the entire Christian world. The popes of the time did not like that Justinian was gaining influence over Christians.
But hey, wait a minute. Weren't they all Christians?
Yes, Pippo, they were all Christians. But the popes of Rome had certain beliefs of how Christianity should be practiced. This included everything from how to teach the Bible to what language people should pray in. And in the Byzantine Empire, they had different ideas about how to practice Christianity, which they saw also as correct. This arguing over the two different approaches eventually led Christianity to split into two factions. In the West, what would become the Roman Catholic Church, led from Rome, and in the East, what would become the Eastern Orthodox Church, led from Constantinople. Let's dig a little deeper with our time compass and find out a little about the history of money. Around 600 BC, the Lydians, settled in what is now Turkey, minted the first coins with images on their sides that we know of. Around the 5th century BC, the Persian king Darius realized the importance of coins and ordered the minting of coins throughout his empire. Around 335 BC, Alexander the Great spread the use of metal coins as his empire grew. Many of them featured images of Alexander himself. In the year 476, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, with no standard system, the use of money partially stopped, and people had to go back to bartering. 1,000 years AD, the exchange of goods with the East began to flow once again. In 1407, one of the very first modern banks was founded in Genoa, Italy. Its name was the Bank of St. George. During the Renaissance, because the public began using money to pay off debts and make other payments, modern